Wealthy Life podcast is designed to share with you everything from mindset training to understanding your finances better so that you can then look to start investing. And of course, I invest in property. But what I really want to do with this podcast is provoke the way you think, get you to think differently, not to just always take what you see for granted. And in this week's episode, I'm joined by Russell Quirk, known for being somewhat controversial, particularly if you've heard him on live TV, which you can also have a look at on YouTube. In his career, he's been an estate agent. In fact, he was born into a family of estate agents, had his own estate agent, was the founder of a company called eMove, one of the first people to create an online estate agent. And he now runs a property-focused PR business. But in amongst all of this, he spends time talking to ministers, talking to investors, talking to everybody in the property world about the housing crisis. And what he has to say is fascinating. So this is the first of a two-part interview. Make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss next week's, and listen in to what we have to say about why private landlords are important, where government is going wrong, where young people are going wrong, and the fact that actually the housing market is buoyant, not only for investors, but actually easier for homeowners to get in than the media would have you believe. So enjoy, subscribe, please do leave me a review, and over to me and Russell Quirk. Hello and welcome to another episode of Wealthy Life, and I am with Russell Quirk, and we're going to be getting, I hope, a little bit provocative. Shall I say provocative? Provocative's a good word. And I wanted to start off by talking about the private rental sector and private landlords as one. I'm just tired of the negative press when actually I feel that we're doing a good job. And you are a worldly wise man, been in the business for a long time, speak to a lot of people, and I just really wanted your take on it rather than me wallowing around at home on my own, festering every time something comes out in the press.
Yeah, it does seem that landlords are painted as the pantomime villain, doesn't it? And have been for some time, both by the press and I think also by politicians. And I think that's just a convenient label. I mean, particularly for the media, because it's that sensationalism, creates a few nice headlines and a few clicks and so on. I think most of the people that criticize landlords for being this kind of private sector, greedy bogeyman, that they've got no idea what being a landlord is. So, the reality of being a landlord is that it's not, it's not Rackman types. Remember Rackman from years ago, that you'd go around and if you didn't pay the rent, you'd smash your front door and smash your toilet and turn your heating off and so on. Maybe that image hasn't helped landlords 20 or 30 years hence, but the majority of landlords are people that own between 1 and 3 properties. They've invested in those properties as a retirement nest egg, and I mean genuinely 99% of them are not only good landlords, but they are empathetic. They are caring, nice human beings. I know lots and lots of landlords that bend over backwards, that go overboard in terms of making sure that the condition of a particular home is more than adequate. It's nice, is above standard. I know a lot of landlords that aren't charging full market rent because they know that their tenant that they like and that is reliable can't afford a 20, 25, 30% hike. So they are charging less than rent. So let's just get it out of the way what landlords really are. What they are not is this big corporate monster that is faceless, that has no ethics, no morals, no heart, no empathy. So the label is where it is, I guess. Now, the irony in all of this, of course, is that the private sector landlord owns the majority of the PRS stock. And the reason that they are so necessary is because house prices have got away from themselves in terms of house prices in many areas for many people being unaffordable. And we can kind of have that debate separately, I guess, if you like, in terms of to what extent that exists across the country. But the fact is now that our ownership rate, our owner occupation rate is only about 62, 63%. It's dropped over the last 20 or 30 years. So the gap has to be filled by private rental sector stock and therefore by landlords. So there's something like 3 million landlords in Britain. The other gap that they fill, of course, Vicky, is that because over the last 30 or 40 years, I'm sure we'll get onto this, governments have been woeful. Let's tell it as it is, pathetic, an embarrassment in terms of the undersupply of social housing, the amount of what we used to call council housing, but social rent, shared ownership, affordable homes. There is such an embarrassing lack of that stock that private sector landlords have been able to step in and fill that gap, frankly. And so they are doing a good job, firstly, and they're doing a necessary job, secondly. I was at an event a little while ago, a few weeks ago, and there was a tenancy protest outside. And I got involved, perhaps foolishly, in that tenancy protest because the tenancy protest narrative was all about landlords being villains. And I kid you not, there were placards with guillotines on them and people depicted on walls with bullet holes.
Yeah.
We can infer from that what those tenant groups think about landlords. They hate them. They want them dead, it seems. And so I ventured, but what would you do without them? I thought that was a reasonable question.
Yeah.
And on social media, all hell let loose, because of course there's no answer to that apart from a silly one. The reality would be, of course, the answer to that from some of those on the tenant advocacy side that think that they're intellectual was, well, of course the tenants would buy all the properties. And of course my response was, okay, well, why don't they do that anyway? Because there's about 600,000 properties for sale on Rightmove right now. So why don't they look down the back of the sofa, find that 10% deposit, that 25 grand, get a mortgage at 4 to 5 times income. Why don't they buy now? And I'll tell you why. It's because those tenants either don't want to buy because they want the flexibility of tenancy, or, let's be really honest, they can't afford to. So, getting rid of landlords overnight by way of some magic bullet and presupposing that there would be an immediate trickle down of that stock into the hands and the wallets of tenants is for the birds. It's ludicrous. So
yes,
the reality is being a tenant is a huge slice of our homeowning demographic. Landlords provide that service, fill that gap. Therefore, they should not be demonized. I do think, and maybe this is a kind of separate segment to this, but I do think that we need to, as a society, stop looking upon renting as almost a second-class existence, because
I agree.
I think there is this element, whether it's media or just society generally, where, oh, you rent, but you don't own. Oh, right, okay. Well, in other countries, Germany, for instance, and many parts of Europe, and in New York, for instance, in Dubai right now, the majority of people rent. And there's nothing wrong with renting because of all the benefits. You don't have to pay stamp duty, you've got flexibility and so on. But in the UK, we do see it almost as a consequence of not being able to buy. And I just don't think it is that. I think changing, forget the Renter Rights Act, as it's now being called, by changing tenure, so you can actually allow tenants, let's say, to agree with the landlord a 10-year tenancy, that would stop the demonization of tenants, I think.
Totally
so anyway,
agree.
look, Vicky, long answer, sorry, but look, it pains me like it does you that landlords are slated completely and utterly unnecessarily. And of course, it's very, very easy if you're a BBC or an ITN or a Channel 4 journalist to find an example of one bad landlord. So we could do that. Ironically, most of these bad landlords turn out to be members of parliament, that you may have remembered. You may remember from weeks ago, whatever his name was, that ex-Tower Hamlets council leader that owns lots of properties and turns out to be one of the worst landlords ever in terms of the condition of his properties. I forget his name. Anyway, so yes, I think we need to make sure that we we assist the PR, if you like, and without plugging what I do for a living as a PR guy, we've got to orchestrate better PR, I think, for the tenancy space, for the landlord space.
No, I agree with you. And that was yes, it might have been a lengthy answer, but I think it really sort of encapsulated everything that I've been feeling about it. And I've like written little notes, and it's so going to pick up with the affordability thing in a minute. Whose fault is the affordability of houses? And then because we touched on it, this whole thing about the Tenancy Rights Act, not so much getting into the detail of that, but more this idea of, I suppose, changing how we view renting. I've got some views. I think the other thing about renting is, yes, it's got this bad stigma, but quite honestly, there are times in your life when buying a house and spending the overhead costs of buying a property are not something to be sniffed at. You've got all the solicitor's fees, the survey fees, the broker fees, all of that sort of stuff going on. Never mind, you then move into the property and you turn it into what you want. If you're very smart, you might be able to increase the value. But if you're only at university, or only on your first job, or only on your early stages of a relationship, is this where you want to live for the rest of your life? And if we demonize being a tenant, then actually renting for that period and working out whether this is the career you want, the area you want to live in, whether you like living away from mum and dad and can work a washing machine, whether you like the person you've moved into, would give you that chance to grow up. And if we then shifted the average age, and I know the average age has been said to be moving later, but that's because of affordability. But we're making that a bad thing that you're buying a house later, whereas I actually think it's a good thing that you're buying later. So let's just go to the affordability thing for a minute, because that whole idea that there's a whole bunch of money down the back of the sofa. And I know you and I spoke about this off air, about this protest and the whole social media for all you got yourself entangled in, which obviously I think you probably
Vicky,
welcome.
it got me banned from Twitter. I was
Oh, did
banned from Twitter, yeah, because I responded in kind to those tenant activists by giving them a bit of stick back, and also
yeah.
actually retweeting a lot of the stuff they were saying about me, because I wanted to obviously to demonstrate that I'm pretty thick-skinned.
Yeah.
And by retweeting some of their abuse, I was the one that got it in the neck from Twitter and got banned for a month.
Oh, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Honestly, who controls, anyway, that's another story. Back to the affordability thing. So what we're talking about at the moment is the fact that maybe, I'm saying it's a fact that maybe it's a fact that less people are able to buy their own homes, get on the ladder, that whole sentence, because house prices have changed. What, in your opinion, is one or two or three things that have caused house prices to escalate in the way that they have, out of the reach of people's affordability, and bearing in mind that affordability is based on the lender saying so many times your salary? I remember when I first worked in mortgages 20-ish, 30-ish years ago, 30 years ago, that we had this thing where we would do 2.5 times joint salary. That was it, 2.5 times joint salary. And now we're looking at 5 times at least,
Well, Nationwide have just announced 6 times income.
So,
Yeah. So, but for the last few years, that 4 to 4.5 times income has been the norm in terms of the amount that you can borrow. Yeah. So why have we ended up in this situation in terms of affordability? Well, I mean, there's two ways that I'd answer that. One is with the reasons, but the other is that actually I don't think house prices are particularly unaffordable. So that's going to be a controversial thing to say.
okay.
I
So
recently
do the
said
reason first, and then we'll do the controversy.
Okay, all right. So there's a number of reasons why it appears that house prices are kind of out of control versus people's reach, should we say. One is lack of supply. So
Yep.
we build roughly 200,000 new homes a year. The new Labour government has said they now want to build between 3 and 375,000 a year to furnish demand. We haven't built that number since the 1960s, so since the days of the Macmillan government. So first of all, there's a huge shortage in terms of the amount of properties that we build. As anyone that's done any basic economics will tell you, if there's demand versus a lesser supply, prices go up.
Yeah.
And obviously we have more demand because we have a growing population for all sorts of reasons. So we've got more people that need housing, and actually the same amount of housing built now as 20 years ago, but actually less housing being built now than 60 years ago. That's reason number one. Reason number two is interest rates. So, historically, if you look at interest rates 20, 30, 40 years ago, interest rates were about 10 to 12%. In fact, they went as high as 15%. I'm just going to move this, sorry.
Yeah. I wondered how long you were going to cope with being blinded every so often.
Well, I was hoping that the cloud cover would help me, but it hasn't. Anyway, right, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. So you were just saying about interest. So go to interest rates change.
Yeah. So the second reason is interest rates. So historically, interest rates over the last, well, certainly 20 or 30 years ago, were an average of about 10%. So if you look at historic interest rates over the last 100 years, interest rates are much, much higher then or over that period than they are now. So obviously we're sitting here as we record this with interest rates at under 5%. You can get a fixed rate mortgage at between 4.5% and 5%. That seems high, particularly if you're a first time buyer from the last 3, 4, 5 years, because you're used to interest rates being much, much lower. But actually the reality is that interest rates were 10% with mortgage rates as high as 15% back in the very late 80s, early 90s. So when you think about affordability, yes, it is the multiple of salary that provides what you can borrow. And the ratio actually of salaries to house prices. So roughly in the UK now, the average house price compared to average salary is about 6.5 to 7 times income. So that's roughly what a house price is versus the average salary. Obviously, it varies hugely. It's much more in London, much less in Cumbria or County Durham, for instance. But that ratio has shifted because that used to be, again, 20, 30 years ago, 4 times. So the increase in house prices at a higher rate than salary growth has been compensated by the fact that interest rates are about half what they were 15 or 20 years ago. It seems that a lot of pundits, a lot of experts, when they're talking about house price affordability, they forget the ingredient, which is the cost of the money. And of course, that's significant. It's no surprise that as interest rates have dropped and dropped and dropped over the last 10 years or so, house prices have responded accordingly, because that means that more people can afford a bigger house and therefore more people have bought. We get back to the supply issue or lack of it, and therefore it's pushed prices up. And I think the third reason probably is culture. And what I mean by that is that we live in a society now dominated by social media, which is that success is seemingly not only important, but really seen as kind of instant and almost essential to your personal brand, should we say. So if you're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc., we all know that people put their best life on social media. They don't tend to put, had a really bad day today, couldn't pay the mortgage, and whatever. What they put on social media is, went to look at this house today, look at this new car I'm thinking about buying, look at me on holiday in Dubai, it cost me a fortune. Right? So we have this success culture, which I think has also bred the seeming necessity to be seen to be doing well, and that includes buying a home. And other things. So I think they're the 3 reasons, I guess. And we've always been, as Brits, I think we've always been a home-owning nation. I remember my grandfather, preaching to the grandkids in the 70s and 80s, my cousins and siblings, that, there was nothing more important than buying a home, particularly when you were young. I went out and bought my first property, my first flat, when I was 18, which is pretty unusual. It's quite unusual then, but certainly unusual now. So this doctrine almost that, there's, safest houses, bricks and mortar, safest form of investment, you must buy something, not only because it's a secure thing financially, but it's almost, I think it's seen as a bit of a badge of honor.
Yes.
That you buy. So I think there's a few reasons there why we've ended up with demand being incredibly strong versus this lack of supply. The consequence has been house prices on average. I mean, this is a rough kind of a rough application, as I'm about to kind of label it here, but about 5% house price increases per annum over the last 20 or 30 years. So obviously we've had our blips, early 90s, 2008-9, but actually we only really had two periods of house price contraction over the last 40 years, really, only two kind of episodes. The rest of the time, house prices have gone up. Sometimes they've gone up, 10, 12, 15% per annum. On average, house prices have gone up by about 5% per annum over the last 30 or 40 years. So that's what's happened. That's why. But to the second point, in terms of, okay, so we all accept that house prices have outstripped wage growth. I guess for some of the reasons that I've also outlined in terms of the cost of money being less, house prices are not as unaffordable as some people in the media would lead us to believe. The rows I have in other places about, the prophecy, the supposition, the argument that first-time buyers can't afford to buy a home. Well, there has never, ever been a time, Vicky, in history where everyone can buy a home, or indeed everyone should be entitled to buy a home. I don't buy into this thing where whoever you are, however successful or not, or active or not, or ambitious or not you are, you have a right to be given a home that you own. No one has that right. You work for it, you take risk, you make sacrifices, you buy a home.
Yes.
So that's always been the case. The reality is we see about 1.2 million transactions in the residential property market every year in the UK. Up to 400,000 of those at the moment are first-time buyers. So about a third, and sometimes it gets more. So I think during the pandemic, it increased to about nearly 50%. So at least a third of all purchases in Britain are by first-time buyers. So if it were true that first-time buyers can't get their foot on the first rung of the property ladder, they can't afford to buy a home, well, you wouldn't be seeing 300,000 to 400,000 of them doing so. Now, we can get into the reasons, apart from low interest rates or low relative interest rates. And there are a bunch of reasons as to why first-time buyers, I think, are not as badly off as some might portray. One of those reasons is the bank of mum and dad, which is huge.
Yeah.
This is the filtering down, the trickling of equity in houses owned by 50 and 60-year-olds, where they take 30 grand, 40 grand, 50 grand, or whatever out of that property, give it to their kids as either a loan or a gift that then allows them to buy their first property. And obviously that deposit barrier is a big one, and that obviously solves that. The other two things, of course, are that first-time buyers have been looked after by government, I think, more than we appreciate over the last 15 years or so. I mean, certainly the last government. And again, not to be political, but it's just a matter of fact. The Conservative philosophy, by the way, is that homeowners are more likely to vote Conservative. So therefore, if you turn more voters into homeowners, guess what? You get more voters. That definitely didn't turn out to be true in July 2024 because they got a kicking, but the philosophy remains. So what was introduced by the likes of, Cameron and Boris Johnson and so on were things like not the right to buy, which obviously Thatcher introduced in the 70s, but help to buy. This philosophy where you could have your deposit matched by the government by way of a securitization of a guarantee. So those schemes were very, very important in terms of getting people into the property market. And then, of course, the other thing that we've had over the last, whatever it is, 4 or 5 years, is a stamp duty holiday, effectively, for all first-time buyers up to about £400,000 purchase price. So if all of a sudden your loan actually is much less than it would have been 15 years ago, even though house prices have increased, you've got no stamp duty to pay, the bank of mum and dad have helped you, and you maybe got a government loan scheme to assist you. Well, that is why, rightly or wrongly, about a third to 45% of all purchases are still by first-time buyers. So my contention, therefore, is they're not that badly off, are they?
No, I completely agree with you. And because I like looking at sort of the history of stuff, this idea of the bank of mum and dad is actually a pre-inheritance, because it's not long ago that mum and dad's life expectancy would have been 60, 70. And so the next generation would be getting their help onto the ladder because mum and dad have popped their clogs. Yeah, whereas because we're living longer, we've got to find ways to pass that family wealth on in a different way. And that bank of mum and dad, as you say, is a great way of doing it. I didn't do bank of mum and dad to my daughters, I taught them how to do it for themselves,
Yep.
because I didn't feel like giving them money was going to give them the skills to appreciate what they had bought. And so I think there's also something missing here in education, a huge, I mean, that's probably a whole podcast episode on its own about young people, or all generations, just not understanding. I call it money maths. We've got this thing called maths, and everybody hates maths at school. And we've got this stuff called money, which is what oils everything in our lives. And no one's sort of put the two together in education and gone, I know you're not liking maths, but actually, if you realize that maths is money, you'd want to learn about it a lot more. Never mind X plus Y equals Z. It's how to do adding up and taking away, and how to manage your bank accounts, and how to understand interest. And as you're saying, everybody's saying, oh, it's all got more expensive. When I mentioned doing mortgages some 30 years ago, I was the one doing mortgages at 12 to 15%. And I remember
Yeah.
one guy coming in, and we'd done the multipliers based on his salary. We'd used, there was a difference between guaranteed overtime and unguaranteed overtime. And that was a letter from your employer. And the employer had to write a letter saying they guaranteed so much overtime a month. And he got an employer to write it, even though it wasn't guaranteed. And it still wasn't accepted. So we got his dad to step in as a guarantor on him buying this one bed flat. And in this whole process, the interest rates went just through the roof. And I knew, because I knew his salary, I knew his income, that there was no way that his dad wasn't going to have to step in and help pay the actual mortgage payments on a monthly basis. The
Yeah.
theory is now that with interest rates being lower and with all the affordability from the lenders, that while mum and dad, if they can, are helping with the deposits, at least they're not having to pay out of their wage packets for essentially two mortgages. The mortgage that they've released the lump sum on, and then still helping junior because the mortgage payments were set at 10 or 15%. There was another thing there, a word that I liked that you said, sacrifice. And there's this bit here too, isn't there, about if you want something, a big purchase, and it is one of the biggest purchases in your house, other than a child, I believe is a large purchase stroke commitment, but a house, then to just assume that you can just get one, like you say, this God-given right to have a house that you own, there's got to be some work towards it, some form of managing your finances. How much do you think that, I suppose, I'm not going to say it's the need on social media, but social media encouraging everybody to live their best life, and that's great. When I was little, I was the only girl in my, or the only child in my school that went abroad at one point. No other kids that I knew of ever went
Yeah.
abroad, because I had an Italian father. We went to Italy. So all this international travel, like we're going to have a long weekend here and we're going to have 2 weeks there. And then, like you say, then we're going to go to Dubai, and then we're going to get a new car, and then I'm going to get something new with a logo on it. But I also want to buy a house and I can't afford my deposit. Well, what else have you been spending your money on? How much do you think that's in there as well?
I think that's huge now. I think, I'm old enough to remember, similar, where, there were certain things that were seen as luxuries that now are seen as standard. I remember having a Chinese takeaway would be a 2 or 3 times a year thing. Now it's every Friday night. It seems that those that have now grown up through the lens of ultra consumerism, I suppose, those, and I don't want to be hard on millennials as such and those younger, but they have grown up with everything being available and everything being instant. So, and I say this as a father of 3 teenage girls, right, who have a nice life. I don't think they're particularly spoiled in terms of their attitude, but they would be absolutely outraged if they didn't have an iPhone 15. If they didn't have access to Netflix, they would think that there was something wrong with the world.
Yes.
If we didn't have 2 or 3 holidays a year, they would probably ring Childline and say, "Dear Childline, my daddy is being nasty to me. We're not even, we're not going long haul this year. We're not even going short haul. I can't believe it." So I think there's an expectation amongst those that are growing up in this this world full of opulence and consumerism, again, through the prism of social media, TV adverts, MTV, Netflix, and so on. And fashion, of course. I mean, fashion was always a thing. I remember growing up at school, it's always about, being seen to be on trend. And that obviously came with a bit of a cost. But what you did as a 15-year-old is you got a job. My first job was collecting trolleys at International Supermarket in London Shopping Centre. And I did that around the ages of 14 or 15 because I wanted the money to be able to go and buy a Fred Perry polo shirt or a pair of brogues or a pair of Stay Pressed trousers. There you go. There's some blasts from the past. Now, kids think, well, my very existence is iPhone with contract, obviously, a Netflix account, being able to go online every 3 or 4 weeks to, Sheen or Shine, whatever it is, and buy stuff online, rather than understanding that all of those things, okay, they weren't available 30 or 40 years ago, but you can't have it both ways. There was a very famous thing, I can't remember who the estate agent was, I think it was Stratton Parker, a few years back, where they jokingly lamented the fact that those would-be first-time buyers that say they can't afford to buy a property maybe should give up Netflix and avocado sandwiches. Do you remember? And there was an outcry in the media saying, well, how outrageous. Well, you do the calculation. If you expect to be able to go and spend £8 a day on lunch in Pret and have a coffee in Starbucks on your way into school, like my daughter who's at sixth form does, and the phone, which is £48 a month, and all the other things, if you add up all that cost, maybe it does get you, obviously it does get you much, much closer to having a deposit at 25 or 28 or 30 years old for a property. So I think there is definitely an issue there, but trying to get that through. I mean, if you had a 23-year-old listening to this now, they would want to castigate me in the comments saying, how rude, that's outrageous. But it's true, because, in the 80s, when I was thinking about buying a property, I had a job, I had a car, that was my only expense. I had an old 800 quid car that I had to insure and put petrol in.
Yeah.
Now a 23-year-old expects to have a new Mini or a Corsa with a sound system and a Spotify subscription, and it's on a lease or a PPP or whatever, and it's just a different world. And I think rather than moaning I can't afford a property, or the media telling everybody that first-time buyers can't afford a property, I think youngsters need to get their priorities right, don't they?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I think it's about appreciation as well, isn't it? There's so much stuff that you can just fill your life with. I mean, I've taken to at the moment, when you play that car game, yellow car, you never see a yellow car, and then you play the yellow car game on long journeys, and then they're everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but you spot
we play that. We play that.
So my thing is spotting yellow box storage companies, or red box, or whatever they call themselves, storage companies. Because the irony for me there is that people are spending their money on so much shite that they need to then spend more money on a space outside of their house in which to store the stuff that they clearly don't need, because they're sticking it in a storage place down the road. And we have the problem here. I don't think I'm materialistic. When we moved into this house, we had 2 Pantechnicons. Granted, the second one was filled with stuff for the garden because I'm a garden loony, but I didn't think I had a lot of stuff. And when we started pulling things down out of the loft, it was like, oh, I remember that. And oh, I remember that. And we haven't used that for a long while. And we sent tons of stuff off to charity. We disposed of other bits throughout the family. We had a storage container that we filled with things that we knew we needed for this house, but not immediately. So we stored them. And we still had this giant lorry. And I don't think I'm materialistic. And there was this slap in the face of just how much do I need all this stuff?
And a lot of this stuff, of course, now is bought because it's trendy for about 5 minutes, and then, of course, it's just thrown away, isn't it? Whether it's clothing isn't designed to last. A pair of shoes isn't designed to last for 5 years anymore, as it is designed to last until the next fashion season, almost. So everything, I think, is more temporary, more trendy. Companies, I think, have got very, very clever at making sure that there are distinct fashions, trends. I mean,
Yep.
Apple are probably the best
Oh,
example. We talk about
yes.
iPhones.
Yes.
I think Apple, I know we're going off on a tangent here, Vicky, but Apple are more of a luxury fashion brand than they are a communication and technology brand, on the basis that every September they change their phone. And they introduce a new camera, a new operating system. They might remove the headphone jack. Everyone gets really excited about the iPhone 96, because the screen is 2 millimeters bigger. But you get all these lunatics in London queuing up outside the
I
Apple
know.
store from midnight because they must have the next one. Why? Well, they must be deeply insecure, frankly, to have to
Yes.
then be seen to be walking around Starbucks and Pret in the West End with the latest rose gold covered iPhone, Ziploc or whatever it's called. Anyway, it's so we've been consumed and sucked into it all, but as a
Yes.
consequence, our priorities when it comes to, food and shelter, they really are our human priorities. And by that I mean buying a property at the age of 25, let's say. Those things have gone out the window. But I also think that youngsters have just become very entitled. I think whenever
Mm.
I've argued about first-time buyers, it seems would-be first-time buyers and political pundits that talk about the housing market, there's an entitlement.
Yeah.
I've genuinely had arguments with people over the months and years. People have said, but everyone should be able to own a home. And I said, no, they shouldn't. They shouldn't. So someone that's on benefits, I'm afraid, that doesn't want to work. I'm not talking about disability. I'm talking about people that don't want to work, or someone that is happy stacking shelves on £9 an hour. I'm afraid the reality socially and economically is they're not going to buy a house. Not everyone can buy a house. Not everyone in the population. I mean, there definitely wouldn't be enough then. And that would actually, ironically, if everyone could buy a house, push prices up even more, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're definitely right about the entitlement. I think there's also the consequences, just to go off on a slight tangent, but I'm going to stop us there, which is there's a documentary on Netflix. I'm not sure if it's still on, but it was talking about how clever the marketeers are, picking up on all of those things that you've said about trends, but the consequences in terms of the pollution that we are leaving in this planet. And they showed, because you mentioned the phones, this idea that they're now sealed units. I remember when you had a computer that there was always a guy in the office that knew how to take the computer to pieces, and you could buy bigger memory and you could have, it looks like the same on the outside, but they would every so often take the box apart, because there was the box part of the computer, and put new memory in and put new bits and pieces in. And then all of a sudden you'd have effectively what was a new computer, but still in the same casing. And that was incredible. Now everything is this sealed unit. And what they're saying is that the phones are now becoming a massive source of pollution, and it's all being sent out to sort of the Far East as the dumping ground for all our plastic shite. And it's just, and the clothes too, I found a top the other day. I was packing for holiday, and I just said to Bob, I have had this halter neck top. Granted, I only wear it in the summer holidays, but I have had this top since I was in my 20s, which is a considerable time ago. And yes, it's got a little bit sort of brown around the seams where it's, had suntan cream on it, but I like it just to wear on the beach because I don't care if it gets mucky. There is no way on earth that anything that I bought in the last 5 or 10 years would last me as long as the clothes that I bought in the past, because they want us to buy more. And the consequences of getting caught in this trap, whether it's through trend, as you mentioned, and the desire to be the first in the queue to get the latest thing with a logo on it, or because the stuff we're buying is shoddy, frankly, not built to last, and that's not just clothes and shoes, but it's also the stuff we fill our houses in, is because people want to part you from your money. And if
Yep.
you decide what you want, what's important to you, and if what's important to you is maybe having, and this is where we're going to link into the last question, the stability of a home that you own, because that makes you feel more comfortable, then you need to shift your financial priorities in that direction. And that stability that comes with the illusion of buying your own home, because that's not as stable, because you have to pay the mortgage, otherwise it's whipped away from you. Because if you put a 10% deposit, you only own 10% of the house, the 90% of it is owned by the bank. Whereas if you rent a house, 100% is owned by the landlord. We're talking about a 10% difference in the two forms of living arrangement. But what we're bound by in legislation is the shortness, and you brought it up right at the beginning, the tenancy. You know, if we just gave our tenants the option, and yes, there needs to be ways that we can break the clauses if something in our lives changed. But if you came to me as a tenant and you said, Vicky, I'm starting my family, you know, I've got a young baby, we want to put them in the school. I know for a fact, because I want my kids to go through this school, that I want to live here for the next 10 years because I've got to get both of them through. And then the older one's going to be at the secondary school. So I'm probably going to be for 15, but definitely for the next 10. Can I have a tenancy agreement for 10 years? I would love that.
Yeah.
You would know that although I owned it instead of the bank, that this was your home, that I would pick up any of the major things like dealing with the roofs and, you know, when the double glazing needed replacing, I'd pick up on the big things, but you could decorate the inside to your style if you wanted it. This box is going to be your home, and I'm going to be the equivalent of like a leaseholder because I've got the responsibility for the outside and the maintenance of this thing. That
Yeah.
would be a wonderful relationship to have.
Yeah, that's exactly how it should work. And also it gives you the sentimental confidence to know that you can put down roots around that property. So we're in the community, schools and so on, because you know that you're there for the long haul, rather than this ridiculous scenario where we have assured short hold tenancy agreements, which predominantly are 1 year long. You know,
Yeah.
and obviously they're now going to be gotten rid of. So periodic tenancy is going to be gotten rid of. So we're doing the opposite of what we're talking about here by way of Angela Rayner's legislation, which is to say, well, now there won't be any implied period at all. The tenant can just stay as long as they want.
So they
Well,
can
that's going
stay
to,
as long as they want, but does that make them feel secure if they haven't got a piece of paper that says that they can stay
well,
for us?
it doesn't, because the problem then is what you want in all deals is both sides to feel good about the deal. Whether it's a commercial deal, you know, some kind of negotiation, whether it's the Middle East or the Ukraine, everyone has to feel goodish about the deal. When you impose those conditions on the landlord and say, well, you can only have your property back if you're actually going to sell it or move into it yourself. Therefore, the tenant can just do what they want. And actually, if they don't pay the rent for 3 months, it doesn't really matter. If they want to give you notice, no notice, and just leave, that's fine. I mean, it's all stacked now in favour of the tenant. What that does is to cause resentment and antagonism between the tenant and the landlord. It's not a happy relationship. It's really bad legislation, which is led by a government, and the previous one for that matter, that really doesn't understand. And this is the whole crux of whether it's house building or the private rental sector, governments legislating over those things. It's a really perilous thing because I'm afraid MPs, ministers, governments don't have the experience, they don't have the knowledge. They make decisions based on political rhetoric. And I know we're going to talk about this a bit more later on. And as a consequence, they make poor decisions. They make bad law. And that's what we're about to see in the Renters' Rights Act.
Absolutely. I think because we've mentioned that, and I know how big that topic's going to be, let's make everybody come back for a part 2, and we'll pick up on these perils of political pandering to the masses, particularly around property and all of that sort of legislation. So look, I've been fascinated by this, and I'm sure the listeners will be, because I think you've very definitely in that idea of it's not actually, oh, what's the word? Unaffordable. Yes, inaffordable, unaffordable. Trouble with my grammar some days. It's not that how people can't afford to buy houses. It's that I think what you're saying is society is twisting our values into what's important. And actually, although on the one hand we're saying, well, you're nobody unless you own your own home, everything in social media is pulling you into buying crap that separates you from your money, so that you then find it harder to actually make the decisions about the things that you want. And I think that for me is sort of like the real eye opener out of this. So I knew you would be a great guest to have, and that we would wander down lines and poke at the edges of things that others may find a little sore. So, Russell, thank you very much for your time so far.
Pleasure. It's been fun. Thank you.
Um, I would love to have you back. We'll do part 2. Is that all right?
Yeah, yeah. And 3 and 4 and 5, whatever.
Yes, we'll add all of the show notes of how you can get in touch with Russell in the bottom of all of this, and then make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss part 2 of our conversation. I'll speak to you again soon, Russell.
All right, many thanks. See you at part 2.
Did you find that provocative? Did you find yourself arguing with us or agreeing with us? Either way is good, as long as you're forming an opinion. Because as we say, if you don't have that opportunity to discuss, we are never going to get to a point where we all have a better understanding of topics. So let me know, do you agree that actually it's easier for first-time buyers to buy their own property than maybe it was 20, 30 years ago? What do you think? And what do you think of the way our ministers and our MPs make decisions, form legislation? Is it good? Is it serving you? Is it making life better? Or is the fact that, quite frankly, they're only going to do something that's going to get a result within the term of their job or their parliament? And no one is actually there paying attention to what we as a country and we as a population need for the long term. I think that's a really interesting thought. Please make sure you subscribe. I'd love it if you left a review. And we will speak again for part 2 of my conversation with Russell Quirk. Speak to you then.